Hey, tonight we're diving into one of history's most fascinating and bloody family feuds. A grudge so powerful it eventually tore a kingdom apart and changed the future of England forever. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in England in the year 1450. The air smells of wood smoke and damp earth, and the world around you is one of castles, knights, and powerful nobles who control vast stretches of land. Good news, you're alive during a fascinating time in history. Bad news, you've arrived just as England is about to descend into 3 decades of brutal civil war. Picture yourself standing on a windswept northern hillside. To the east are the lands of the Percy family, the powerful Earls of Northumberland, their banners fluttering over castles that have stood for generations. To the west, the equally powerful Neville family, Earls of Westmoreland and Salisbury, look out from their stone fortresses. These two families rule the north of England like kings in all but name, and for years they've managed to coexist in an uneasy peace. But beneath the surface, tensions have been building. The Percy and Neville families aren't just neighbours, they're rivals for power, influence and royal favour, and like a pot left too long on the fire, their simmering dislike for each other is about to boil over in ways that will engulf the entire kingdom. You might think that mighty kingdoms fall because of grand ideologies or the clash of powerful armies. Sometimes that's true, but more often, history turns on something much more personal: wounded pride, jealousy, and the burning desire for revenge. And that's exactly what we're going to witness. The story of England's Wars of the Roses, that terrible civil conflict that tore the country apart between 1455 and 1487, didn't begin with kings and princes fighting over the crown. It began with 2 proud northern families who simply couldn't stand each other anymore. Let me tell you about these 2 families. The Percys had long been the dominant power in northern England. As Earls of Northumberland, they were responsible for defending England against Scottish invasions, and they'd grown wealthy and powerful as a result. Henry Percy, the 2nd Earl of Northumberland, was the head of the family, a proud man whose father, known as Hotspur, had rebelled against King Henry IV and died for it. The Percys had slowly rebuilt their reputation and power, but they carried with them the memory of past slights and humiliations. Across the hills, the Neville family had risen to prominence more recently, but no less impressively. Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, led this ambitious clan. His sister Cecily had married Richard, Duke of York, a man with his own claim to the English throne. The Nevilles were shrewd, ambitious, and experts at political manoeuvring, and Richard Neville's son, also named Richard, would one day earn the nickname Kingmaker for his uncanny ability to decide who sat on England's throne. Now, you might be wondering what caused these 2 powerful families to hate each other so much. The truth is, historians still debate the exact origins of their feud, but what we do know is that it wasn't just about land or wealth, though those certainly played a part. It was about something much more fundamental to medieval life: status and power. You see, in medieval England, power wasn't just about how much land you owned or how many men-at-arms you could call to battle. It was about your relationship with the king. Royal favour meant everything: grants of land, lucrative offices, marriages for your children, and the ability to outshine your rivals. And in the court of the weak King Henry VI, both the Percys and the Nevilles were competing fiercely for that royal favour. By 1453, the situation in England was already unstable. King Henry VI, unlike his warrior father Henry V, who had conquered much of France, was a meek and pious man ill-suited to kingship. France had been lost, the royal coffers were empty, and discontent was spreading throughout the realm. It was the perfect backdrop for a family feud to escalate into something much more dangerous. The spark that finally ignited this powder keg came, as it often does in history, from a wedding. In August 1453, Sir Thomas Neville, the second son of the Earl of Salisbury, was to marry Maud Stanhope, the niece and heir of Lord Cromwell. This might seem like an ordinary noble marriage, but there was a catch. Maud stood to inherit former Percy lands that had been lost years before. The thought of those ancestral Percy lands passing into Neville hands was simply too much for the Percy family to bear. Thomas Percy, Lord Egremont, the hot-headed second son of the Earl of Northumberland, decided to take action. He gathered over 1,000 men, a small army really, and prepared to ambush the Neville wedding party as they travelled home to Sheriff Hutton Castle. On August 24, 1453, the two forces met at Heworth Moor, just outside the city of York. Lord Egremont and his Percy followers confronted the Neville wedding party, which included the Earl of Salisbury, his wife, the newlywed couple, and another of Salisbury's sons, John Neville. Though both sides were armed and ready for battle, neither wanted to risk starting a major conflict. There was pushing and shoving, harsh words and threats, but surprisingly little bloodshed. The Nevilles managed to force their way through and reach the safety of Sheriff Hutton. But this confrontation, minor as it may have seemed, was just the beginning. It was like the first small crack in a dam, seemingly insignificant, but a warning of the flood to come. In the weeks that followed, the feud escalated quickly. The Percys attacked Neville properties, and the Nevilles retaliated in kind. Sir John Neville raided the Earl of Northumberland's house at Catton in Yorkshire and nearly destroyed it. The next day, Richard Percy attacked Neville property in response. These weren't just neighbourly disagreements, they were acts of open warfare between two of the most powerful families in the land. King Henry VI tried to intervene, sending letters commanding both sides to cease their attacks and solve their differences peacefully. But the king's authority meant little to these proud nobles, especially as Henry himself was struggling with a debilitating mental illness that had left him unable to rule effectively since the summer of 1453. With the king incapacitated, the country needed a leader. The obvious choice was Richard, Duke of York, who was not only a prince of royal blood with his own claim to the throne, but also happened to be the brother-in-law of the Earl of Salisbury. Here was the crucial connection. The personal feud between Percy and Neville was about to become entangled with a much larger struggle for control of the entire kingdom. As October 1453 turned to November, the Percy and Neville forces came dangerously close to full-scale battle. At Topcliffe, the Percy clan gathered 10,000 men just 4 miles away at Sheriff Hutton. The Nevilles assembled their own army. England stood on the brink of civil war as these two northern powerhouses prepared to settle their differences with steel and blood. A major clash was narrowly avoided through royal intervention, but the peace was short-lived. On October 31st or November 1st, 1454, the two sides finally met in battle at Stamford Bridge, ironically the same location where King Harold had defeated Viking invaders nearly 400 years earlier. Several hundred men died and Lord Egremont was captured by John Neville, further humiliating the Percy family. The Duke of York, who had been named Lord Protector during the king's illness, was using his newfound power to favour his Neville in-laws. The Percys, traditional supporters of King Henry VI and his formidable queen, Margaret of Anjou, found themselves increasingly sidelined. What began as a local dispute in the north was quickly becoming a flashpoint that would divide the entire country. The Percy Neville feud was forcing other nobles to choose sides, creating fault lines throughout English society. It was no longer just about two families. It was becoming a struggle that would determine who ruled England. As you lay in your bed in 1454, you might have heard whispers of these events, tales of proud lords raising armies, of ambushes and raids, of a kingdom slowly fracturing along lines of loyalty and ambition. You might not have realised it yet, but you were witnessing the beginning of what later generations would call the Wars of the Roses. What made this conflict particularly bitter was the element of personal betrayal. The Percys and Nevilles weren't just political rivals, they were connected by marriage and had once been allies. Richard Neville, the Earl of Salisbury, was actually the brother-in-law of Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland. Their wives were sisters. This wasn't just politics, it was family. And that made the desire for revenge all the more potent. When Lord Egremont was finally released from captivity after being captured at Stamford Bridge, he didn't return home humbled and chastened. He returned burning with the desire to make the Nevilles pay for his humiliation. By the spring of 1455, England was divided into two camps. On one side stood the Duke of York and his Neville allies, who had been forced to surrender power when King Henry recovered from his illness. On the other side were the king's close advisers, including Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and the Percy family, who had the support of Queen Margaret. The stage was set for the first major battle in what would become a 30-year struggle for the English crown, and it all began because two proud northern families couldn't set aside their grievances for the greater good of the kingdom. As you lie in your comfortable bed in the present day, safely removed from the blood and chaos of medieval warfare, remember that history is often shaped not by grand ideologies or inevitable forces, but by very human emotions: pride, ambition, jealousy, and the burning desire for revenge. The winds are picking up outside the castles of northern England, and storm clouds are gathering. The Percy Neville feud is about to explode beyond the borders of Yorkshire and engulf the entire kingdom in fire and sword. And you, my friend, have a front row seat to one of history's most dramatic and consequential family feuds, one that would change the course of English history forever. The gentle rhythm of rain begins to patter against your window, a soothing counterpoint to the tale of coming conflict. The Percy and Neville banners snap in the wind as armies gather in the twilight. Tomorrow the storm breaks. As the first rays of dawn break over the English countryside, you find yourself standing on a gentle hill overlooking a small town called St Albans. The date is May 22nd, 1455, and the sleepy market town below is about to become the site of the first pitched battle in what will later be known as the Wars of the Roses. The morning mist is just burning off, revealing the colourful banners of two armies, one already entrenched in the town, the other approaching from the east. The town is held by King Henry VI and his loyal nobles, including Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland. These are the Lancastrians, though they don't call themselves that yet. They simply see themselves as the king's loyal subjects. Among them, the Percy retainers stand ready, their thoughts filled with memories of the humiliations they've suffered at Neville hands. Today might be the day for revenge. Outside the town, the approaching army is led by Richard, Duke of York, accompanied by his powerful Neville allies, Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, and his son, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. These men, who will later be identified with the Yorkist cause, have come with a stated purpose of removing evil counsellors from around the king. They don't claim to be fighting the king himself. They claim to be saving him from bad advisers like Somerset. But beneath these noble-sounding intentions lies something much more personal. The Percy-Neville feud that began in the north has now escalated to the point where both sides see armed confrontation as the only solution. For the Nevilles, defeating the king's army means defeating their Percy rivals once and for all. For the Percys, standing with the king means a chance to crush the upstart Nevilles. You can almost feel the tension in the air as the two armies prepare to meet. It's not just about politics or even loyalty to different factions of the royal family. For many of the men on both sides, this is deeply personal. Knights and men-at-arms who had clashed in Yorkshire during the previous 2 years now faced each other again, but this time there would be no holding back. The battle begins with an attempt at negotiation. York and the Nevilles send messages to the king asking for Somerset to be handed over to them. They claim they have no quarrel with King Henry himself, only with his evil advisors. But Somerset is one of the king's closest friends, and Henry refuses to abandon him. The negotiations fail, and the Yorkist troops prepare to attack the town. The narrow streets of St Albans give the advantage to the defending Lancastrians. As Yorkist troops try to force their way through the narrow lanes, Lancastrian archers rain arrows down on them. You can hear the terrible sounds of battle, the twang of bowstrings, the clatter of arrows striking shields, the screams of wounded men. The initial Yorkist attacks are repulsed with heavy casualties. But then comes a moment that changes everything. The Earl of Warwick, showing the military genius that would make him famous, realises that frontal assaults are failing. Instead, he leads a force through the gardens and houses on the edge of town, breaking through back walls and fences, outflanking the Lancastrian defences. It's a brilliant tactical move, and suddenly Warwick's men burst into the town centre, taking the Lancastrians completely by surprise. The battle quickly turns into a chaotic street fight. In the narrow lanes and small market squares of St Albans, knights who would normally have fought on horseback are forced to dismount and fight hand to hand. There's no room for the grand cavalry charges or orderly formations of traditional medieval warfare. Instead, it's a brutal, intimate kind of combat. Men hacking at each other with swords and axes, fighting for their lives just feet apart from one another. In the confusion, King Henry VI is wounded by an arrow in the neck. The wound isn't serious, but the king, never a warrior by nature, is frightened and disoriented. He takes shelter in a tanner's cottage, abandoned by his bodyguards who are busy fighting for their lives. Meanwhile, in a narrow lane near the Castle Inn, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, finds himself surrounded by Yorkist troops. The Percy retainers fight desperately to protect their lord, but they're outnumbered and outflanked. You can almost hear the clash of steel on steel, see the flash of sunlight on bloodied blades. Northumberland fights bravely, but a blow to the head brings him down. The Earl of Northumberland, head of the great Percy family, lies dead in the muddy street of St Albans. Not far away, Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, has taken refuge in the Castle Inn, but the Yorkists batter down the doors, and Somerset emerges, sword in hand, determined to sell his life dearly. He fights like a man possessed, reportedly killing 4 men before he's finally cut down. Somerset too falls dead in the streets of St Albans. The Battle of St Albans is over almost as quickly as it began. It wasn't a large battle by medieval standards. Probably fewer than 100 men were killed, but among those dead were some of the most powerful men in England, including the Earl of Northumberland and the Duke of Somerset, leaders of the Lancastrian faction and bitter enemies of York and the Nevilles. As the dust settles and the smoke clears, King Henry is found trembling in the tanner's cottage. York and the Nevilles approach him with great shows of respect and loyalty. They kneel before him, swearing that they are his true servants and have only fought against traitors who had misled their king. Henry, always pliable and eager to avoid conflict, accepts their protestations of loyalty. The Yorkists have won the day, and King Henry is now effectively their prisoner. For the Percy family, the Battle of St Albans is nothing short of catastrophic. Not only have they lost the head of their family, but their bitter rivals the Nevilles now stand triumphant beside the king. The new Earl of Northumberland is Henry Percy's son, also named Henry, who now burns with the desire to avenge his father's death. The seeds of revenge have been sown, and they will bear bitter fruit in the years to come. The aftermath of the battle sees the Duke of York appointed as Lord Protector of England, effectively ruling in the name of the increasingly unstable King Henry. The Nevilles receive positions of power as well, with Salisbury becoming Chancellor of England. The Percy family and other Lancastrian supporters are excluded from power, nursing their grievances and plotting their return. But the consequences of St Albans reach far beyond the immediate political situation. What had begun as a private feud between two northern families has now escalated into a national conflict. Blood has been spilled, great lords have fallen, and the kingdom is divided. Most importantly, a precedent has been set. Disputes that once might have been settled through legal channels or royal mediation are now being decided by force of arms. Queen Margaret of Anjou, King Henry's formidable wife, is particularly affected by the battle's outcome. Although she wasn't present at St Albans, she's horrified to learn that her husband was wounded and that his loyal supporters were killed while defending him. She becomes convinced that York and the Nevilles pose a mortal threat not just to her husband's authority, but to the future of her young son, Edward, Prince of Wales, who had been born in October 1453. Margaret is a woman to be reckoned with, intelligent, determined, and utterly devoted to securing her son's inheritance. Where her husband is weak and vacillating, she is strong and decisive, and she never forgets an enemy. The deaths at St Albans, particularly that of her friend Somerset, fill her with a burning desire for vengeance against York and the Nevilles. The Queen becomes the rallying point for Lancastrian resistance, and her thirst for revenge will drive much of the conflict in the years to come. The years following the First Battle of St Albans are marked by an uneasy peace. York's second protectorate ends when King Henry recovers his senses in early 1456, but real power now rests with Queen Margaret and her circle of loyal lords. The Queen makes it her mission to sideline York and the Nevilles, gradually removing them from positions of influence and replacing them with men she trusts. Meanwhile, in the north, the conflict between the Percys and Nevilles continues to simmer. The new Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy, hasn't forgotten that his father died at St Albans while Neville soldiers looked on. His younger brother, Thomas Percy, Lord Egremont, still smarts from his defeat and capture at Stamford Bridge. For these proud men, the feud isn't over. It's merely entered a new and deadlier phase. The most significant development during this period is the rise to prominence of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the son of the Earl of Salisbury. Warwick is appointed Captain of Calais, England's last major possession in France, giving him command of the only standing army under English control. He uses this position to build up his power and wealth, becoming one of the richest and most influential men in England. Later generations will call him the Kingmaker for his role in deciding who sits on England's throne. By 1458, King Henry, always eager for peace, tries to reconcile the warring factions. On March 24, 1458, he stages a grand public ceremony known as the Love Day. The rivals from both factions walk hand in hand in a procession to St Paul's Cathedral in London, making a public show of forgiveness and reconciliation. The Duke of York walks with the Queen, while Somerset's son walks with Salisbury and Exeter walks with Warwick. But this display of unity is merely a facade. Behind the forced smiles and clasped hands, hatred and distrust run as deep as ever. The sons of the lords killed at St Albans have not forgiven their father's killers. The Percys have not forgotten their humiliation at the hands of the Nevilles. And Queen Margaret continues to view York and his allies as the greatest threat to her son's inheritance. You might be surprised how quickly such a public reconciliation falls apart. In fact, the Love Day only serves to paper over the cracks in English society, cracks that are widening by the day. Within months, the rival factions are once again building up their armed retinues and preparing for a renewal of conflict. The breakdown begins in 1458 when Warwick, returning from Calais, is attacked in London by the servants of the royal household. He fights his way to the safety of his barge on the Thames and escapes back to Calais, convinced that the Queen had ordered his assassination. Whether this attack was planned by the Queen or was simply a spontaneous brawl is unclear, but its effect is to destroy any pretense of reconciliation. Queen Margaret, now firmly in control of the government, begins to move against York and the Nevilles. She summons a great council to meet at Coventry, traditionally a Lancastrian stronghold, in June 1459. York and the Nevilles, suspecting a trap, refuse to attend. In response, the council declares them traitors, effectively forcing them into open rebellion. For the new Earl of Northumberland, this is the opportunity he's been waiting for. The Percy family throws its full support behind the Queen, eager to help destroy their Neville enemies once and for all. Revenge for the death of the old Earl at St Albans is now within reach. The summer of 1459 sees both sides raising armies across England. The country is sliding inexorably towards civil war, driven not just by political differences, but by personal vendettas and the desire for revenge. What began as a feud between two northern families has now engulfed the entire kingdom. In September 1459, the first clash of this new phase of the conflict takes place at Blore Heath in Staffordshire. The Earl of Salisbury, leading a Yorkist force toward Ludlow, where they plan to meet up with York, is intercepted by a Lancastrian army led by Lord Audley. Despite being outnumbered, Salisbury wins the battle through superior tactics, inflicting heavy casualties on the Lancastrians. But this victory proves short-lived. The main confrontation comes at Ludford Bridge near Ludlow in October 1459. York, Salisbury and Warwick find themselves facing a much larger royal army. Worse still, a contingent of experienced soldiers from the Calais garrison who had accompanied Warwick to England refuses to fight against the king's banner and defects to the Lancastrian side. Realising that defeat is inevitable, York and his eldest son Edmund, Earl of Rutland, flee to Ireland. Salisbury, Warwick and York's eldest son Edward, Earl of March, the future King Edward IV, escape to Calais. Their wives and younger children are left behind at Ludlow Castle, which is sacked by the victorious Lancastrian troops. For the moment, the Lancastrians have triumphed, and the Percy family can savour the defeat of their Neville enemies. The aftermath of Ludford Bridge sees the Yorkist leaders attainted for treason by a parliament that meets at Coventry in November 1459. This Parliament of Devils, as Yorkist sympathisers called it, strips York, Salisbury, Warwick and their key supporters of their titles and estates, declaring them traitors to the crown. The Percy family benefits from this redistribution of wealth and power, regaining lands they had lost to the Nevilles years before. For the Lancastrians, victory seems complete. York is exiled in Ireland, the Nevilles are confined to Calais, and Queen Margaret rules England in her husband's name. The Percy family stands high in royal favour, rewarded for their loyalty with lands and offices. But history is rarely so simple, and fortunes in this conflict have a way of reversing with dramatic suddenness. In Calais, Warwick is busy rebuilding his strength, using the resources of the garrison to launch raids on English shipping in the Channel. He's also in communication with Yorkist sympathisers in England, many of whom are unhappy with the harsh rule of the Queen and her favourites. In June 1460, Warwick, Salisbury and Edward, Earl of March, make their move. They land at Sandwich in Kent with a small force and march on London, gathering support along the way. Londoners, who have long favoured the Yorkist cause, welcome them with open arms. Warwick presents himself not as a rebel, but as a loyal subject seeking to rescue the king from evil counsellors. The same justification used before the First Battle of St Albans. With London secured, Warwick and Salisbury march north to confront the royal army, which has assembled at Northampton. King Henry is present with the army, though real command rests with the Duke of Buckingham and other Lancastrian lords. The Earl of Northumberland is also there, eager to avenge his family's setbacks and defeat his Neville enemies once and for all. But fate and the English weather have other plans. On July 10th, 1460, as the two armies face each other outside Northampton, a heavy rainstorm waterlogged the field. The Lancastrians had prepared a strong defensive position with artillery positioned to fire at any attackers. But the rain renders their cannons useless. The powder is too wet to ignite. Even worse, treachery undermines the Lancastrian defences. Lord Grey of Ruthin, commanding one section of the Lancastrian line, suddenly changes sides in the middle of the battle, allowing Warwick's troops to enter the Lancastrian camp unopposed. The battle quickly turns into a rout. The Duke of Buckingham, the Earl of Shrewsbury, and Lord Egremont, Thomas Percy, are killed trying to protect the king. Once again, King Henry is captured by the Yorkists, and once again the Percys suffer a devastating defeat at the hands of their Neville enemies. The victorious Yorkists bring King Henry back to London, treating him with elaborate courtesy while effectively keeping him prisoner. They use his name and authority to legitimise their actions, issuing orders and proclamations under the royal seal. For the second time, the Nevilles have triumphed over the Percys in a decisive battle, adding fresh grievances to the blood feud between the families. After the Battle of Northampton, the Duke of York returns from Ireland with a shocking new claim. No longer content to rule through the captured king, York enters Parliament and places his hand on the empty throne, claiming it as his rightful inheritance. This move stuns even his own supporters. York argues that his claim to the throne, through descent from Edward III's second son, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, is superior to Henry's claim through John of Gaunt, Edward III's third son. After days of deliberation, a compromise is reached. Henry will remain king for his lifetime, but York will be named his heir, disinheriting Henry's own son, Prince Edward. This arrangement, known as the Act of Accord, satisfies no one. York's supporters feel he should be king immediately, while Lancastrians are outraged that the young prince has been disinherited. For Queen Margaret, who has fled to Scotland with her son, the Act of Accord is an abomination that must be overturned at all costs. She begins raising a new army in the north, where Lancastrian sentiment is strongest. Many northern lords, including survivors of the Percy family, rally to her banner, eager to reverse their recent defeats. In December 1460, York and Salisbury march north to deal with this new threat, leaving Warwick in London to guard the king. They reach Sandal Castle near Wakefield in Yorkshire just before Christmas. On December 30th, 1460, York makes the fatal mistake of leaving the castle's safety to engage what he thinks is a small Lancastrian force. Instead, he finds himself facing Queen Margaret's main army. The ensuing Battle of Wakefield is a disaster for the Yorkists. Outnumbered and outmanoeuvred, they're quickly overwhelmed. York himself is killed in the fighting, along with his second son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland. The Earl of Salisbury is captured and executed the following day. The heads of York, Rutland, and Salisbury are displayed on spikes over the gates of the city of York, York's head mockingly adorned with a paper crown. At a stroke, the Lancastrians have eliminated two of their most dangerous enemies, York and Salisbury, but they've also created martyrs whose deaths will be avenged. York's eldest son, Edward, Earl of March, now inherits his father's claim to the throne, and Salisbury's son, the Earl of Warwick, now has his own reasons for revenge. For the Percy family, the Battle of Wakefield is sweet revenge for their defeats at St Albans and Northampton. They've helped destroy their Neville enemies and restored Lancastrian control in the north, but their triumph will be short-lived. The wheel of fortune continues to turn, and in this conflict, today's victors often become tomorrow's victims. As Queen Margaret's victorious army marches south toward London, they engage in widespread looting and pillaging, alienating many who might otherwise have supported their cause. Meanwhile, Edward, Earl of March, has won his own victory at Mortimer's Cross in Herefordshire, defeating a Lancastrian force led by Jasper Tudor. The stage is set for the next great confrontation in this bloody family feud that has become a war for England's throne. The winds of war continue to blow across England, carrying with them the cries of the fallen and the prayers of those yet to fight. The Percy-Neville feud has grown beyond its northern origins, engulfing the entire kingdom in a conflict that will eventually be known as the Wars of the Roses. And the desire for revenge that most human of emotions continues to drive the conflict forward, ensuring that more blood will be spilled before England finds peace again. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the snow falling softly on the battlefield of Wakefield, gradually covering the bodies of the fallen Yorkist and Lancastrian alike. The revenge that began between two proud families has now claimed the lives of some of England's greatest lords, including York himself. But the story is far from over. The sons of the fallen will rise to continue the struggle, driven by that same powerful desire for revenge that started it all. As a new day dawns over England, you find yourself standing on another battlefield. Snow is falling gently, dusting the armour of the soldiers preparing for combat with a soft white layer that will soon be stained crimson. It's February 17th, 1461, and you're witnessing the Second Battle of St Albans, where Queen Margaret's Lancastrian army, filled with Percy supporters seeking revenge, is about to clash once again with Warwick's Yorkist forces. Warwick has marched north from London with King Henry in tow, still a prisoner but treated with all the ceremony due to a monarch. The Earl has positioned his army on the outskirts of St Albans, the very town where this terrible civil war began 6 years earlier. He's ordered his men to dig trenches and set up primitive anti-cavalry defences called caltrops, metal spikes designed to lame charging horses. Warwick is confident in his position and his larger numbers. But Queen Margaret and her Lancastrian commanders have a surprise in store. Instead of attacking from the expected direction, they make a wide flanking manoeuvre, approaching St Albans from the west. Warwick's carefully prepared defences are now useless, facing the wrong way. As dawn breaks, Lancastrian scouts report that the Yorkist army is completely unprepared for an attack from this direction. The battle begins with a Lancastrian assault on Warwick's exposed flank. Yorkist troops, caught off guard, struggle to reposition themselves in the falling snow. Confusion reigns as commands are shouted and countermanded. You can almost feel the rising panic among the Yorkist ranks as they realise they've been outmanoeuvred. In the chaos of battle, something remarkable happens. King Henry, left under light guard as the fighting intensifies, is found by Lancastrian troops led by Sir Thomas who, the king sitting under a tree apparently singing to himself, is rescued by his wife's army. For the Percy family and other Lancastrians, recapturing the king is a tremendous victory, reversing their humiliation at Northampton. Meanwhile, the battle itself is going badly for Warwick and the Yorkists. Their formations are broken and many of their troops are fleeing. The Earl of Warwick, realising that defeat is inevitable, manages to escape with a small retinue, riding hard for London to regroup with Edward, Earl of March. The rest of the Yorkist army disintegrates, some surrendering, others scattering across the countryside. For the Lancastrians, and particularly for the Percy family, the Second Battle of St Albans is sweet revenge for their previous defeats. They've recaptured the king, routed Warwick's army, and reversed the setbacks they suffered at the First Battle of St Albans and at Northampton. Queen Margaret is reunited with her husband, though witnesses report that the king barely recognised her or their son, so deep was his mental confusion. In the aftermath of victory, Margaret allows her 7-year-old son, Prince Edward, to decide the fate of captured Yorkist knights. The boy, already schooled in the harsh realities of civil war, orders their execution. 2 knights, Lord Bonville and Sir Thomas Kyriel, who had stayed with King Henry throughout the battle at the king's own request, are beheaded despite Henry's promise of protection. It's a stark reminder that in this conflict, chivalry and mercy are early casualties. After their victory, you might think the Lancastrians would immediately march on London to secure the capital, but Queen Margaret hesitates. Her northern troops, many from the Scottish borders, have engaged in widespread looting and pillaging during their march south. Reports of these atrocities have reached London, terrifying the citizens and turning them firmly against the Lancastrian cause. The city refuses to open its gates to the Queen's army. Instead, Margaret withdraws northward with her forces, taking King Henry with her. It's a critical strategic error. While the Queen retreats, Edward, Earl of March, now the Yorkist claimant following his father's death at Wakefield, joins forces with Warwick in London. The city welcomes them enthusiastically, relieved to be spared what they fear would be a sack by Margaret's unruly northern troops. On March 4th, 1461, in a bold and decisive move, Edward is proclaimed King Edward IV in London. Unlike his father, who had merely claimed to be heir to the throne, Edward takes the crown directly, arguing that Henry has violated the Act of Accord by allowing his supporters to attack Yorkist forces. The 19-year-old Edward is everything that Henry VI is not. Tall, handsome, charismatic, and a brilliant military commander. Where Henry inspires pity, Edward inspires confidence. But proclamations in London mean little if they can't be enforced throughout the realm. Edward knows that to secure his crown, he must defeat the Lancastrian army decisively, gathering all available forces, including contingents brought by the Duke of Norfolk and the Earl of Warwick. Edward marches north in pursuit of Queen Margaret's army. The two forces are set on a collision course that will lead to the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. As Edward's army marches northward, the weather turns bitterly cold. Snow and sleet lash the soldiers, and icy winds cut through the thickest cloaks. It's as if nature itself is warning of the terrible bloodshed to come. The Yorkists reach Pontefract on March 27th, where they learn that the Lancastrian army is positioned near the village of Towton, about 12 miles southwest of York. The following day, a Yorkist detachment under Lord Fauconberg encounters Lancastrian forces holding the crossing of the River Aire at Ferrybridge. The Lancastrians, led by Lord Clifford, whose father died at St Albans and who had personally killed the Earl of Rutland after Wakefield, initially drive the Yorkists back. But Edward and Warwick bring up reinforcements, and Clifford is forced to retreat. During this withdrawal, Clifford himself is killed by an arrow to the throat, another noble life claimed by the vendetta that's consuming England's aristocracy. On Palm Sunday, March 29th, 1461, the main Yorkist and Lancastrian armies finally meet near the village of Towton. The Lancastrians, commanded by the Duke of Somerset, son of the Somerset killed at St Albans, and Henry Percy, the new Earl of Northumberland, hold a strong position on a plateau, with flanks protected by steep slopes leading down to marshy ground. They outnumber the Yorkists significantly, with perhaps 30,000 men to Edward's 20,000 or so. As the battle begins, a blizzard is blowing directly into the faces of the Lancastrian troops. Lord Fauconberg, commanding Edward's archers, uses this to devastating effect. He orders his men to shoot one volley high into the air toward the Lancastrian lines, then quickly retreat out of range. The Lancastrian archers, unable to see clearly through the driving snow, respond by shooting their own arrows, which fall short due to the headwind. Fauconberg then has his men move forward and collect the fallen Lancastrian arrows, which they shoot back at the enemy with the wind now behind them. After this exchange of arrows, the two armies close for hand-to-hand combat. What follows is not the choreographed, almost balletic combat you might see in films. Medieval battle was a crushing, chaotic press of bodies where men fought and died packed so tightly they could barely swing their weapons. The snow beneath their feet quickly turns to mud, then to a red slush as blood soaks the ground. For hours, the battle rages with neither side gaining a clear advantage. Men are fighting to the point of exhaustion, then being replaced by fresh troops from behind. The noise is deafening, the clash of weapons, the screams of the wounded and dying, the shouts of commanders trying to be heard above the chaos. The snow continues to fall, reducing visibility and adding to the confusion. The turning point comes in the afternoon when the Duke of Norfolk arrives with fresh Yorkist reinforcements, striking the Lancastrian left flank. This, combined with the sheer exhaustion of troops who have been fighting since morning, finally breaks the Lancastrian line. What begins as a disciplined withdrawal soon turns into a rout as panic spreads through the Lancastrian ranks. Many fleeing Lancastrians are funneled into the steep-sided valley of the Cockbeck, a stream swollen by melting snow. Trying to cross, they slip on the icy banks or are pushed in by the press of bodies behind them. Hundreds drown, while others form human bridges of the dead and dying that are then used by their comrades to cross. The Yorkists pursue relentlessly, cutting down the fleeing men. It's said that the Cockbeck ran red with blood for days afterward. The slaughter is unprecedented. Chronicles of the time claim that 28,000 men died that day, though modern historians suggest a lower but still shocking figure of perhaps 9,000 to 10,000 casualties. Either way, Towton stands as the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, with more Englishmen killed in a single day than on the first day of the Somme in World War I. Among the dead is Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, the head of the Percy family and one of the principal architects of the Lancastrian resistance. For the Percys, Towton is a catastrophe. Not only have they lost their leader, but their bitter rivals the Nevilles now stand triumphant alongside the new Yorkist king. The Neville-Percy feud, which helped spark this terrible civil war, has resulted in the virtual destruction of the Percy family's power. Queen Margaret, King Henry, and their son, Prince Edward, were not present at the battle, having remained in York. When news of the disaster reaches them, they flee northward towards Scotland, accompanied by the Duke of Somerset and other surviving Lancastrian lords. Edward IV enters York triumphantly on March 30th, where he orders the heads of his father and brother, still displayed on spikes above the city gates, to be taken down and given proper burial. The new king then returns to London, where he's formally crowned on June 28, 1461. The House of York has seemingly triumphed, and the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, stands at the height of his power as Edward's chief supporter and advisor. The feud that began between the Percys and Nevilles has resulted in a change of dynasty. But the story is far from over. Though the Percy family has been dealt a severe blow, they are not yet destroyed. Thomas Percy, Lord Egremont, the hot-headed younger son who had started the feud by attacking the Neville wedding party back in 1453, was killed at Northampton. But other Percy relatives survive, nursing their hatred for the Nevilles and their determination to restore Lancastrian rule. In the years following Towton, Edward IV works to consolidate his rule. The Lancastrian resistance continues, particularly in the north, where loyalty to the old Percy affinity remains strong, and in Wales, where Jasper Tudor keeps the Lancastrian cause alive. The new king faces numerous challenges: rebellions to suppress, a treasury to refill, and foreign relations to manage, particularly with France and Burgundy. Warwick, as Edward's right-hand man, takes on many of these responsibilities. He crushes Lancastrian resistance in the north, recapturing castles that had held out against Yorkist rule. He negotiates with foreign powers and manages much of the day-to-day governance of the realm. But signs of strain in his relationship with Edward begin to appear. The first major disagreement comes over Edward's choice of bride. Warwick favours a French marriage alliance, and he's deeply engaged in negotiations for Edward to marry a French princess. But in 1464, Edward announces that he has secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, the beautiful widow of a Lancastrian knight. It's a love match rather than a politically advantageous alliance, and Warwick is furious at having been undermined. The situation worsens as Edward begins to favour his new wife's large and ambitious family. The Woodvilles secure advantageous marriages and appointments, displacing some of Warwick's own family and allies. For Warwick, this is not just a political setback, but a personal affront. After all he's done for Edward, he expects to remain the power behind the throne. Meanwhile, the remnants of the Percy family are watching these developments with interest. Despite their defeat at Towton, they have not abandoned their cause or their hatred for the Nevilles. The Percy lands and titles have been confiscated, with much of their property given to John Neville, Warwick's brother, who is created Earl of Northumberland in 1464. It's the ultimate humiliation for the Percy family, their ancestral title bestowed upon their bitterest enemy. But the Percys find an unlikely ally in Warwick himself. As the Earl grows increasingly disenchanted with Edward IV, he begins to look for alternative paths to power. By 1469, Warwick is in open rebellion against Edward, allied with the king's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Though their first attempt to seize control fails, they try again in 1470, this time making the extraordinary decision to ally with their old Lancastrian enemies. In France, Warwick makes peace with Queen Margaret and agrees to help restore Henry VI to the throne. As part of this agreement, Warwick's younger daughter Anne is betrothed to Margaret's son, Prince Edward. The man who had been the most feared enemy of the Lancastrians is now their champion, driven by his personal vendetta against Edward IV. Warwick invades England in September 1470, and his timing is perfect. Edward IV is in the north dealing with another rebellion, and he's caught off guard by Warwick's return. With his position untenable, Edward flees to Burgundy with his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and a small band of loyal followers. Warwick enters London triumphantly and restores Henry VI to the throne in what becomes known as the Readeption. During this brief Lancastrian restoration, the Percy family begins to recover some of its losses. Henry Percy, son of the Earl killed at Towton, is released from the Tower of London, where he's been held since 1464. The Nevilles, who had so dominated northern England, now find their position threatened as old Lancastrian families reclaim lands and offices lost after Towton. but Warwick's triumph is short-lived. Edward IV returns from exile in March 1471 with Burgundian support. Landing in Yorkshire, he moves quickly to London, gathering support along the way. Warwick attempts to intercept him, but is outmanoeuvred. Edward enters London and recaptures the hapless Henry VI, then turns to face Warwick at Barnet, just north of the city. The Battle of Barnet, fought on April 14, 1471, takes place in a thick fog that causes confusion on both sides. In the poor visibility, one wing of Warwick's army attacks another by mistake, leading to cries of treachery and the collapse of Lancastrian morale. Warwick himself, attempting to flee when all is lost, is cut down and killed. The Kingmaker is dead, his body stripped of armour and valuables, and left naked on the ground until Edward orders it taken up and displayed at St. Paul's to prove to all that the great Earl is truly gone. On the very day of Barnet, Queen Margaret and her son Prince Edward land at Weymouth, having finally come from France to join Warwick. The news of his defeat and death is a crushing blow, but the Queen is determined to fight on. She gathers what forces she can and marches toward Wales, hoping to join up with Jasper Tudor's Lancastrian forces there. Edward IV moves swiftly to intercept her, and the two armies meet at Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471. Once again, Edward's superior generalship carries the day. The Lancastrian army is routed, and Prince Edward, the last direct male heir of the House of Lancaster, is killed either in the battle or, more likely, executed shortly afterward. The Duke of Somerset and other Lancastrian leaders are captured and beheaded 2 days later. Queen Margaret is captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Shortly afterward, on the night that Edward IV returns triumphantly to London, Henry VI dies in the Tower, almost certainly murdered on Edward's orders, though officially it's announced that he died of pure displeasure and melancholy. With both Henry and his son dead, the main Lancastrian line is extinguished, and Edward IV's position seems secure at last. For the Percy family, these events bring both opportunity and continued hardship. With Warwick dead and his brother John Neville, who had been made Earl of Northumberland, discredited by his family's rebellion, Edward IV decides to restore Henry Percy to his ancestral title. In 1473, Percy is released from the Tower and becomes the 4th Earl of Northumberland. Edward judges, correctly, that the Percys are now less of a threat than the overmighty Nevilles had been. Yet this restoration comes with strings attached. The new Earl of Northumberland must demonstrate unwavering loyalty to the Yorkist regime. He's required to keep the turbulent north peaceful and to suppress any lingering Lancastrian sentiment. It's a delicate balancing act to regain his family's position while accepting the triumph of his family's ancient enemies. The Neville family, meanwhile, has suffered a catastrophic reversal of fortune. Warwick is dead, his brother John executed after Barnet, and most of their vast estates confiscated by the crown. Warwick's widow is stripped of her inheritance, and his daughters become pawns in royal marriage politics. Anne Neville, who had been betrothed to the Lancastrian Prince Edward, eventually marries Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's younger brother. Through her, Richard gains control of a portion of the old Warwick inheritance, adding to tensions between him and his other brother, George, Duke of Clarence, who had married Warwick's elder daughter Isabel. As the 1470s progress, England finally enjoys a period of relative peace under Edward IV's rule. The king, though still young, has learned from his earlier mistakes. He keeps a tighter control on the nobility, prevents any single family from becoming too powerful, and builds up the royal treasury through careful management and trade agreements. The lessons of the Percy-Neville feud, how a private quarrel between nobles can escalate into a kingdom-wide conflict, have been well learned. but beneath the surface, tensions remain. The old wounds have not fully healed, and new rivalries are emerging. Edward IV's brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is building a power base in the north, in some ways replacing the Neville-Percy dominance with his own. He works closely with the restored Earl of Northumberland, but their relationship is complex, marked by both cooperation and competition. As you lie in your warm, comfortable bed in the present day, imagining these events of centuries past, remember that the Wars of the Roses were not yet over. The death of Edward IV in 1483 would trigger another round of conflict, with Richard of Gloucester seizing the throne from Edward's sons, becoming King Richard III. The Earl of Northumberland would make the fateful decision to remain neutral when Henry Tudor invaded in 1485, contributing to Richard's defeat and death at Bosworth Field. The Percy-Neville feud that had helped spark the Wars of the Roses had largely burned itself out by then, with the Neville family's power broken and the Percys carefully navigating the dangerous waters of royal politics. But the pattern established during their conflict, of personal vendettas escalating into political crises, of noble families using royal authority to pursue private grudges, would continue to shape English history for generations to come. As sleep begins to claim you, imagine the snow still falling on the battlefield of Towton, covering the thousands of dead with a gentle white shroud. The personal feud that began with a wedding ambush in 1453 had, within a decade, redrawn the map of power in England and changed the course of the nation's history. It's a stark reminder that even the mightiest kingdoms can be brought low by the human desire for revenge. The wind outside your window seems to carry the distant sounds of clashing swords and the cries of men in battle, echoes of a time when two proud families let their hatred for each other tear a kingdom apart. But these are just echoes now, fading into the night as you drift into dreams of knights and castles, kings and queens, and family feuds that changed the world. The candles burn low as night deepens, casting long shadows across your room. Outside, an owl calls softly, and the wind whispers secrets of long ago. It's time to return to our tale of family revenge and royal ambition, a story where personal grudges changed the destiny of a kingdom. The year is 1471. Edward IV, the young Yorkist king who seized his crown on the blood-soaked field of Towton, has returned triumphantly to England after being forced into exile. His former ally turned enemy, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the man history would remember as the King-Maker, lies dead, his naked body displayed at St. Paul's Cathedral as proof of his fall. The Neville family, once so powerful they could challenge kings, is broken and scattered. For the Percy family, these are strange and uncertain times. Their bitter feud with the Nevilles helped ignite the Wars of the Roses, but now, with the Nevilles destroyed, what place remains for them in this New Yorkist world? Henry Percy, son of the Earl killed at Towton, remains imprisoned in the Tower of London, his family's lands and titles stripped away after their support for the Lancastrian cause. Queen Margaret of Anjou, that fierce defender of her husband Henry VI and their son, has landed at Weymouth on the very day of Warwick's defeat at Barnet. When she hears of the Kingmaker's death, she reportedly weeps, not from grief for a man she had long considered her enemy before their unlikely alliance, but from the realization that her cause has suffered a devastating blow. Nevertheless, the Queen is determined to fight on. Margaret gathers what forces she can and begins marching toward Wales, hoping to join Jasper Tudor's Lancastrian supporters there. The Lancastrian cause still has powerful adherents. The Duke of Somerset, Lord Wenlock, the Earl of Devon, and others who have too much to lose should Edward IV consolidate his rule. Many of these men are driven not just by political calculation, but by personal vendetta. Somerset's father and brother died fighting for Lancaster. For him, as for so many others, this war is about family as much as it is about crowns. Edward IV, now a seasoned military commander at just 29 years of age, moves swiftly to intercept the Queen. He has learned the value of speed and decisiveness, qualities his Lancastrian opponents often lack. Marching rapidly westward, he prevents Margaret from crossing the Severn into Wales, forcing her to give battle at Tewkesbury on May 4th, 1471. The Battle of Tewkesbury unfolds in the lush green meadows beside the River Severn. Somerset, commanding the Lancastrian vanguard, initially gains ground with a fierce attack, but he's lured into an ambush by Edward's brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester. The young Richard, just 18 years old, is already showing the military skill that will make him a formidable commander. From concealed positions in woods on the field's edge, Yorkist archers and men-at-arms fall upon Somerset's exposed flank. As the Lancastrian attack falters, Edward leads his main force in a devastating charge. The Lancastrian line crumbles and the battle becomes a rout. Many fleeing soldiers drown trying to cross the swollen River Severn. Others seek sanctuary in Tewkesbury Abbey, but are dragged out and executed despite the church's supposed protection. The most significant casualty is Edward, Prince of Wales, Henry VI, and Margaret's only son. The 17-year-old prince, the focus of Lancastrian hopes for nearly 2 decades, is killed either during the battle or, more likely, during its immediate aftermath. With his death, the direct male line of Lancaster is extinguished. Margaret of Anjou is captured days later, her fighting spirit finally broken by her son's death. She will spend 5 years as a prisoner before being ransomed by her cousin, King Louis V of France. She returns to her native Anjou, dying in poverty in 1482, a shadow of the formidable queen who had once led armies across England. Edward IV returns to London in triumph, and on the very night of his arrival, the last obstacle to his rule is removed. Henry VI, the sad, bewildered king who had worn England's crown for nearly 40 years, dies in the Tower of London. Though officially attributed to pure displeasure and melancholy, few doubt that Henry was murdered on Edward's orders. With both Henry and his son dead, the Lancastrian claim to the throne passes to the obscure Tudor family through Margaret Beaufort, a descendant of John of Gaunt, Edward III's third son. For the Percy family, watching these events unfold from the sidelines, a surprising opportunity now presents itself. Edward IV, secure on his throne, no longer fears the northern magnates as he once did. More importantly, he sees value in restoring the traditional power structures in the north, where Percy influence had maintained order for generations. The Nevilles, who had replaced the Percys as the dominant northern family, have been largely destroyed by Warwick's rebellion. In 1473, Edward makes a crucial decision. He releases Henry Percy from the Tower and restores him as the 4th Earl of Northumberland. It's a calculated risk. The Percys had been staunch Lancastrians, but Edward believes the new Earl will be loyal out of gratitude and necessity. The king's judgment proves correct. Northumberland becomes one of the most reliable Yorkist supporters, helping to maintain royal authority in the turbulent north. This restoration marks a strange conclusion to the Percy-Neville feud. The Nevilles, who had schemed and fought their way to dominance, now find themselves broken. Warwick's widow is stripped of her inheritance, while his daughters become pawns in royal marriage politics. The vast Neville estates are divided, with much of Warwick's land going to the king's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who marries Warwick's younger daughter, Anne. The Percys, conversely, despite backing the losing Lancastrian side, managed to survive and eventually regain much of their former position. It's a curious reversal of fortune, a reminder that in the dangerous game of medieval politics, sometimes losing more slowly than your enemies counts as victory. The kingdom finally enjoys a period of peace under Edward IV's renewed rule. The king, having learned harsh lessons during his first reign, governs more effectively. He keeps tighter control over the nobility, prevents any single family from becoming too powerful, and rebuilds the royal treasury through careful management and trade agreements. The personal feuds that had torn England apart seem for a time to be contained. But beneath the surface, new tensions are brewing. Edward's youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, is building a power base in the north, in some ways replacing the old Neville-Percy dominance with his own. Richard works closely with the Earl of Northumberland, but their relationship is complex, characterised by both cooperation and latent rivalry. Edward's middle brother, George, Duke of Clarence, grows increasingly resentful of his diminished influence at court. Always unstable and ambitious, Clarence begins plotting against the king again, despite having been forgiven for his earlier treachery with Warwick. Edward's patience finally runs out in 1478 when he has Clarence arrested and convicted of treason. The Duke is executed privately in the Tower of London, reportedly drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, a strange, somewhat undignified end for a Prince of the Blood. The 1470s witnessed the evolution of Edward IV from a young warrior king to a mature, sometimes calculating ruler. He grows physically as well, his once athletic frame becoming corpulent from indulgent living. His court is known for its splendour and festivities, a stark contrast to the austere, pious atmosphere of Henry VI's reign. Yet Edward never loses his political shrewdness or his ability to act decisively when needed. In the north, the restored Earl of Northumberland works diligently to rebuild Percy influence. He faces challenges. Many former Percy retainers had died in the wars, and some of their lands have been granted to others, particularly to the Duke of Gloucester. But Northumberland is patient and pragmatic. He understands that survival in these dangerous times requires flexibility and an ability to adapt to changing political winds. When Edward IV dies unexpectedly on April 9th, 1483, at the age of just 40, England is plunged back into crisis. The king's heir, Edward V, is only 12 years old, too young to rule independently. Edward IV had named his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector, trusting him to guide the young king until he came of age. What follows is one of history's most controversial episodes. Richard, travelling south from his northern power base, intercepts the young king who is being brought to London by his maternal relatives, the Woodville family. In a series of bold moves, Richard arrests several Woodville supporters, takes custody of both Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, and arranges to have himself declared king as Richard III. The official justification is that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid due to a pre-contract with another woman, making their children illegitimate. The two young princes are lodged in the Tower of London, ostensibly for their protection, but they soon disappear from public view entirely. Their fate becomes one of history's great mysteries, with most contemporaries believing, and later Tudor historians insisting, that Richard had them murdered to secure his crown. During these tumultuous events, the Earl of Northumberland plays a cautious game. He accompanies Richard from the north and supports his seizure of power, at least initially, but there are signs that Northumberland is uncomfortable with Richard's actions, particularly regarding the fate of the princes. When Richard is crowned on July 6, 1483, Northumberland is present, but perhaps not as enthusiastic as the new king might have wished. Richard III's reign is troubled from the start. In October 1483, barely 3 months after his coronation, a rebellion erupts in southern England. Though quickly suppressed, it reveals the depth of opposition to Richard's rule. The king responds by distributing land and offices to secure loyalty, particularly in the north where his support is strongest. The Earl of Northumberland benefits from this policy, receiving additional grants and responsibilities. Yet Northumberland's relationship with Richard remains ambivalent. The Percy family has a long history of Lancastrian loyalty, and Richard's usurpation has alienated many who had accepted Edward IV's rule. Moreover, Richard's power base in the north sometimes conflicts with traditional Percy interests. There is no open break between king and earl, but neither is there the wholehearted support Richard desperately needs. In the summer of 1485, the final act of the Wars of the Roses begins to unfold. Henry Tudor, the Lancastrian claimant in exile, sets sail from France with a small army. His claim to the throne is tenuous at best, derived from his mother's Beaufort lineage and strengthened by his pledge to marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter. But Tudor represents the last hope for those opposed to Richard III's rule, and he has powerful backers, including the French crown. When Tudor lands at Milford Haven in Wales on August 7th, Richard moves to confront him. The king summons his supporters, including the Earl of Northumberland. On August 22nd, 1485, the two armies meet at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire. The Battle of Bosworth is not a large engagement by the standards of Towton or Tewkesbury, but its consequences are momentous. Richard III positions his forces on a hill, with Northumberland commanding the rear division. As the battle develops, something extraordinary happens. Northumberland fails to commit his troops, effectively standing aside from the fight. At the crucial moment, another nobleman, Sir William Stanley, leads his forces against Richard rather than for him. Richard, seeing his position collapsing, makes a desperate charge directly at Henry Tudor. It's a brave but fatal decision. The king is surrounded and cut down. According to tradition, Richard's crown is found under a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry's head by Thomas Stanley, William's brother, who proclaims him king. Northumberland's inaction at Bosworth has been debated by historians ever since. Was it deliberate betrayal, tactical confusion? Had there been a secret agreement with Tudor? We may never know for certain, but the consequences are clear. Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, is dead. Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, establishes a new dynasty that will rule England for the next 118 years. For the Percy family, Bosworth represents another delicate transition. The Earl of Northumberland is briefly arrested after the battle but soon released. Henry VII, like Edward IV before him, recognises the value of Percy influence in the north. Northumberland is confirmed in his titles and estates, though probably watched closely for signs of disloyalty. The irony is striking. The Percy-Neville feud that had helped ignite the Wars of the Roses ends with both families diminished but surviving. The Nevilles, once so powerful under Warwick, have lost much of their influence, though cadet branches of the family will continue. The Percys retain their position as Earls of Northumberland, but are more firmly under royal control than before. The true losers are the great royal houses, Plantagenet, Lancaster and York, who have destroyed each other in 3 decades of conflict. Henry VII, acutely aware of how noble feuds had undermined royal authority, takes steps to prevent their recurrence. He restricts the right of nobles to maintain large retinues of armed men. He establishes the Court of Star Chamber to deal with disputes that might once have led to private warfare. He arranges marriages to reconcile former enemies and bind them to his new regime. It seems to work, at least for a time. The Tudor dynasty brings stability after the chaos of civil war, yet echoes of the old conflicts remain. In 1489, the Earl of Northumberland is killed while attempting to collect taxes in Yorkshire. Local people, resenting the financial demands, rise up and murder the Earl, a stark reminder of the tensions still simmering beneath the surface of Tudor rule. The personal vendetta between Percy and Neville has long since been overshadowed by larger dynastic struggles, but its consequences have shaped English history. What began as a confrontation at a wedding in 1453 helped trigger a conflict that redrew the map of power in England and changed the course of the nation's future. As our story draws to a close, I want you to imagine standing in the great cathedral at York. Before you are the tombs of generations of Percy Earls, their stone effigies lying in eternal repose, hands clasped in prayer. Not far away, in other churches and chapels across northern England, lie the remains of their Neville rivals. These proud, ambitious men who once moved armies on the chessboard of power are now dust, their quarrels long forgotten by most. Yet the consequences of their feud still echo through history. The Wars of the Roses transformed England's governance, weakening the old nobility and eventually strengthening the monarchy. The Tudor dynasty that emerged from the conflict would change England forever, separating from Rome under Henry VIII and ushering in the golden age of Elizabeth III. None of this might have happened without that initial spark, the personal hatred between two northern families that escalated into a kingdom-wide conflagration. The lesson of the Percy-Neville feud is both simple and profound. Personal grudges, when nursed by the powerful, can have consequences far beyond their origins. What begins as a private quarrel can end by toppling thrones and reshaping nations. It's a lesson as relevant today as it was in the blood-soaked fields of medieval England. Sleep comes to claim you now, carrying you away from tales of long-ago battles and ancient vendettas. As you drift into dreams, perhaps you'll see the banners of York and Lancaster, Percy and Neville, fluttering in a breeze that blew out centuries ago. Or perhaps you'll dream of the quiet fields of Towton and Tewkesbury, now peaceful under the English sun, where once men fought and died for family honour and ambition. The candle gutters in its holder, casting one last flicker of light across the room. Outside, the night deepens toward dawn. The Wars of the Roses, that terrible conflict born of family revenge, has passed into history, leaving behind only memories, lessons, and the occasional ghostly echo of steel on steel carried on the wind across the gentle hills of England. Morning light begins to filter through your window as our tale of revenge, ambition and power draws to a close. The Percy-Neville feud that sparked England's bloodiest civil war has left its mark on history, transforming a kingdom and shaping the course of a nation. As we conclude our journey through this turbulent era, let's reflect on what happened to these families and the legacy they left behind. The year is 1485. Henry Tudor, now King Henry VII, sits uneasily on England's throne. The Battle of Bosworth has ended the Plantagenet dynasty that ruled England for over 3 centuries. The new Tudor king faces the immense challenge of healing a realm torn apart by 30 years of intermittent civil war, where noble families turned against each other in pursuit of vengeance and power. For the Percy family, Bosworth represented yet another precarious moment in their long history. Henry Percy, 4th Earl of Northumberland, had failed to commit his troops during the battle, an action or inaction that helped seal Richard III's fate. Was it deliberate betrayal, strategic hesitation, or simple confusion in the chaos of battle? Historians still debate this question, but the consequences were clear. Richard died, and with him the Yorkist dynasty that had ruled England since 1461. Henry VII treats the Earl of Northumberland cautiously. The Percys remain too powerful to ignore or destroy, particularly in the north, where royal authority has always been tenuous. Northumberland is briefly imprisoned, but soon released and confirmed in his titles and estates. The Tudor king, pragmatic and shrewd, recognises that governing England's troublesome northern regions requires Percy cooperation. But the wheel of fortune that had turned so many times during the Wars of the Roses spins again for the Percy family. In 1489, just 4 years after Bosworth, Henry Percy is killed while collecting taxes in Yorkshire. Local people, resentful of the financial demands of their new Tudor king, rise up in revolt. When the Earl arrives to suppress the disturbance, he is pulled from his horse and murdered by the mob. It's an inglorious end for a nobleman who had survived the bloodiest period of English history through careful political manoeuvring. The 4th Earl of Northumberland is succeeded by his son, also named Henry, who becomes the 5th Earl. The Percy line continues, though never again with the same independence and power they had wielded before the Wars of the Roses began. The Neville family, once so dominant under the Earl of Warwick, emerges from the conflicts severely diminished. The main line of the family, Warwick's direct descendants, effectively ends with his death at Barnet in 1471. His daughters become pawns in royal marriage politics. Isabel, wed to the ill-fated Duke of Clarence. Anne married first to the Lancastrian Prince Edward, and then, after his death, to Richard of Gloucester, the future Richard III. When Anne Neville dies in 1485, shortly before Bosworth, the vast Warwick inheritance is absorbed by the crown. The cadet branches of the Neville family survive, but with reduced lands and influence. The mighty family that once challenged kings has been cut down to size. The Percy-Neville feud that had helped ignite the Wars of the Roses fades into memory as both families adjust to the new Tudor reality. Henry VII takes deliberate steps to prevent such destructive noble rivalries from threatening royal authority again. He restricts the right of nobles to maintain private armies, those bands of retainers who had made the feud so dangerous. He establishes new legal institutions, particularly the Court of Star Chamber, to resolve disputes that might once have led to private warfare. Most importantly, Henry VII centralises power in a way his Lancastrian and Yorkist predecessors never managed. The nobility, exhausted by decades of conflict and decimated by battlefield deaths and executions, lacks the strength to resist. Many of the greatest families, including branches of the Percys and Nevilles, had backed the losing side in various phases of the conflict and suffered attainders, confiscations and executions as a result. The Wars of the Roses fundamentally transformed England's power structures. Before the conflict, England was governed through a delicate partnership between the monarchy and a powerful semi-independent nobility. Afterward, the balance shifts decisively toward the crown. The Tudor monarchs who follow Henry VII, particularly his son Henry VIII and granddaughter Elizabeth I, build on this foundation to create a stronger, more centralised state than England had ever known. This transformation didn't happen overnight, nor was it solely the result of Tudor policy. The seeds were planted decades earlier, when the Percy-Neville feud demonstrated how dangerous unchecked noble power could be, when two families could raise armies, defy royal authority, and eventually help depose kings. The traditional medieval system of governance was revealed as dangerously unstable. The personal tragedies that emerged from the feud, the deaths of lords at St Albans, Wakefield, Towton, and other blood-soaked fields, gradually convinced many that strong royal authority was preferable to noble independence. By the time Henry VII seized the throne, England was ready for a new approach to governance, one that would rein in the great magnates and prevent private quarrels from escalating into national catastrophes. As you lie in your bed, warm and safe in the modern world, it's easy to see these events as distant history, disconnected from our present reality. But the patterns revealed in the Percy-Neville feud have echoed through the centuries and across cultures. Whenever personal grievances among the powerful are allowed to fester and grow, the potential for widespread harm increases exponentially. Think of the Hatfields and McCoys in American history, whose decades-long blood feud cost numerous lives and destabilized entire counties. Or consider the gang violence that has torn apart communities in our own time, often sparked by personal vendettas that spiral out of control. The scale may differ, but the fundamental human dynamics remain eerily similar. The Percy Neville feud also reminds us how quickly alliances can shift when personal ambition enters the equation. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, helped Edward IV gain the throne, then turned against him when his own influence was threatened. He eventually allied with his former enemies, the Lancastrians, in pursuit of his personal vendetta against Edward. Such dramatic reversals of loyalty characterised the entire Wars of the Roses, making the conflict exceptionally confusing even for those living through it. This pattern, too, has repeated throughout history. Personal slights and wounded pride have driven political betrayals from ancient Rome to modern parliaments. The desire for revenge, that most fundamental human emotion, can override rational calculation and lead to self-destructive decisions, as Warwick discovered at Barnet, where his remarkable career ended in defeat and death. The long-term consequences of the Percy Neville feud and the wars it helped ignite went far beyond changes in governance. The conflicts decimated England's old nobility, creating opportunities for new men to rise. The Tudor period saw the emergence of a new aristocracy, many drawn from the gentry or merchant classes rather than the ancient noble houses. Families like the Seymours, the Dudleys and the Cecils, who would play crucial roles in Tudor governance, rose to prominence in a landscape cleared by the destruction of older noble lines. This social mobility brought fresh energy and ideas to English government. It also created a more education-focused elite, as advancement increasingly depended on administrative skill rather than martial prowess. The medieval knight was gradually replaced by the university-educated courtier as the ideal nobleman. This shift would eventually help fuel the English Renaissance under Elizabeth I, as the new elite patronised arts and learning to demonstrate their refinement and worth. The religious changes that transformed England in the 16th century, Henry VIII's break with Rome and the subsequent Protestant Reformation, were also indirectly influenced by the legacy of the Wars of the Roses. Henry's obsession with securing a male heir, which drove his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and the break with the Catholic Church, stemmed partly from his awareness of how dynastic uncertainty had plunged England into civil war before his father seized the throne. The Tudor propaganda machine worked tirelessly to portray the Wars of the Roses as a cautionary tale about the horrors of disputed succession and civil strife. William Shakespeare's history plays, written during the late Elizabethan era, reinforced this narrative, depicting the period as a time of chaos that was only resolved by Tudor rule. Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, was particularly maligned, transformed from a complex historical figure into the arch-villain of Tudor mythology. This Tudor version of history, though biased and often inaccurate, served an important purpose. It reminded the English people of the stability the Tudor dynasty had brought after decades of conflict. Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch, skillfully exploited this narrative during her long reign, presenting herself as the guarantor of peace and order against the threat of renewed civil strife. For the Percy family, the Tudor era brought a gradual restoration of fortunes, though never to their pre-war heights. The 6th Earl of Northumberland, another Henry Percy, found favour with Henry VIII and played a significant role in the king's early reign. Ironically, he fell deeply in love with Anne Boleyn before she caught the king's eye. When Henry VIII decided to marry Anne, Percy was forced to give her up and instead married Mary Talbot, a union that proved deeply unhappy. This personal disappointment was compounded by political challenges. The sixth Earl became entangled in the complicated religious politics of Henry VIII's reign. Though he participated in the suppression of the Pilgrimage of Grace, a northern rebellion against Henry's religious changes, Percy himself had Catholic sympathies. He died without legitimate children in 1537, and the Percy earldom temporarily passed to his brother, Sir Thomas Percy. Thomas Percy's tenure as Earl of Northumberland was brief and ended tragically. He became involved in a northern rebellion known as the Bigod Rebellion and was executed for treason in 1538. The Percy titles were then attainted and their lands seized by the crown. Though the earldom was eventually restored to Thomas's nephew, the family's power and independence were permanently diminished. The Neville family experienced similar ups and downs during the Tudor period. While the main line associated with Warwick had ended, other branches of the family survived and occasionally prospered. Charles Neville, 6th Earl of Westmoreland, initially found favour under Elizabeth I, but eventually joined the Rising of the North in 1569, a Catholic rebellion against the Queen. When the rebellion failed, Neville fled to exile in the Spanish Netherlands, and his estates were confiscated. Thus, more than a century after their feud helped ignite the Wars of the Roses, both the Percy and Neville families found themselves on the wrong side of Tudor authority, clinging to the old Catholic faith in an increasingly Protestant England. Their northern power bases, once the source of their independence, became liabilities as the centralised Tudor state viewed regional autonomy with suspicion. By the end of the Tudor era, the world that had made the Percy-Neville feud possible had vanished. Noble families could no longer maintain private armies or wage private wars. Royal authority had been strengthened and expanded into previously semi-autonomous regions, like the North. The medieval system of governance, with its delicate balance between monarchy and nobility, had given way to the early modern state. Yet the human dynamics that drove the feud, pride, ambition, vengeance, loyalty to family, remained unchanged. These elemental forces continue to shape history, though they now play out in different arenas and under different constraints. The business tycoons who battle for market dominance, the political dynasties that compete for power, even the feuding celebrities who trade barbs on social media, all are, in some sense, heirs to the Percys and Nevilles, driven by the same fundamental human impulses. What, then, are we to learn from this ancient quarrel that spilled so much blood and changed the course of a nation? Perhaps the most important lesson is the danger of allowing personal grievances to override the common good. The Percy-Neville feud, legitimate as its initial grievances may have been, eventually harmed both families and damaged the kingdom they claimed to serve. Their pursuit of vengeance and advantage ultimately weakened the very system that had given them their privileged position. There's also a lesson about the unpredictability of conflict. Neither the Percys nor the Nevilles could have foreseen how their local dispute would escalate into a kingdom-wide civil war. Once violence begins, it develops its own momentum, drawing in new participants and creating fresh grievances that demand redress. What starts as a controlled confrontation can quickly become an uncontrollable conflagration. Finally, the Percy-Neville feud reminds us how closely the personal and political are intertwined. Modern observers often try to separate these spheres, analysing political events as if they were driven solely by rational calculations of advantage. But history repeatedly shows us that personal relationships, loyalties and antagonisms play crucial roles in shaping political decisions. The human heart, with all its passions and contradictions, remains a powerful force in world affairs. As morning light fills your room, our journey through this turbulent period of English history comes to an end. The Percy-Neville feud and the Wars of the Roses it helped ignite have receded into the past, their battles now marked only by peaceful meadows and commemorative plaques. The noble families that fought so fiercely for power and vengeance have either died out or adapted to changed circumstances, their descendants often unaware of the dramatic roles their ancestors played. Yet the story continues to fascinate us, not just as an exciting tale of battles and betrayals, but as a mirror reflecting our own human nature. In the ambitions of Warwick the Kingmaker, we may recognise our own desire for influence and recognition. In the Percy family's determination to avenge slights to their honour, we might see echoes of our own impulse to right perceived wrongs. In the tragic consequences of these seemingly justified actions, we can perhaps find caution for our own choices. As you drift back towards sleep, perhaps to dream of armoured knights and colourful banners, remember that history is not just about kings and battles, dates and treaties. It's about people, flawed, complex, contradictory people making choices that seem reasonable to them but often lead to unexpected outcomes. It's about the patterns of human behaviour that repeat across centuries, teaching us about ourselves if we're willing to learn. The Percy-Neville feud changed England forever, helping transform a medieval kingdom into the foundations of a modern state. It's a powerful reminder that even private quarrels, when they involve those with power, can have consequences far beyond their original scope. As Shakespeare, that great chronicler of the Wars of the Roses, wrote, "The smallest worm will turn being trodden on." The desire for revenge, that most human of emotions, can sometimes change the course of history itself. Sleep well, dreamer of the past. May your own paths be free of feuds and vendettas, your life unmarked by the bitter fruits of revenge. The Percy and Neville lords, who once moved armies across the chessboard of power, have found their final peace. Their story is now yours to remember and perhaps to learn from, a distant echo of battles long ago carried on a gentle breeze across the quiet fields of England.